July 1941, Tobruk, Libya. The Germans had the port surrounded on three sides, with the Mediterranean Sea at the defenders' backs and nowhere to run. Inside the perimeter, 25,000 Allied soldiers waited in trenches and bunkers carved from the hard desert rock. They waited for supply ships that might not come. They waited for relief forces that were hundreds of miles away. Most of all, they waited for the next artillery shell, the next tank attack, the next probe by German infantry that could crack their defenses wide open. The siege was only weeks old, but already men whispered that Tobruk would fall just like every other fortress Rommel had attacked. What nobody knew yet, not even the Australians themselves, was that this North African port would become the place where German soldiers learned to fear an enemy who refused to fight the way soldiers were supposed to fight. The crisis was simple and brutal. British commanders had ordered a standard defensive strategy. Stay in your trenches, conserve ammunition, wait for the enemy to attack, then fight them off. Do not waste men on unnecessary risks. Every military manual said this was how you held ground when outnumbered and surrounded. The problem was that it was killing them slowly. Each night, German patrols crept close to the Allied lines. They watched. They learned. They called in artillery on exact positions. During the day, Axis planes bombed supply dumps and water stations with growing accuracy. The defenders lost 10 men here, 20 men there, bleeding away their strength while accomplishing nothing. Morale dropped like a stone. British units that had fought well in other battles now sat in holes, staring at the empty desert, wondering when the final attack would come. The statistics told a grim story. In the first month of siege, the Allies lost over 400 men without inflicting serious damage on the enemy. The Germans surrounded them with 45,000 troops and could bring up more whenever they wanted. Rommel's panzers sat just beyond artillery range, waiting for the right moment to punch through. Inside Tobruk, food rations dropped to half portions. Water was limited to 1 gallon per man per day, and that had to cover drinking, cooking, and washing in the desert heat that climbed past 110 degrees. The math was brutal and simple. If things continued this way, the Germans would not need to attack. They could just wait for Tobruk to collapse from within. German intelligence officers studied the Allied units and felt confident. Their reports described the British as disciplined but tired. The Polish brigade was small and isolated. The Indian troops were reliable but needed strong leadership. As for the Australians who were arriving to reinforce the garrison, the Germans saw them as colonial amateurs. These were farmers and sheep herders from the other side of the world, the report said. They might be brave, but they had no experience against a modern European army. They certainly would not change the outcome of the siege. Then Major General Leslie Morshead arrived with the 9th Australian Division, and everything the Germans thought they knew turned out to be dangerously wrong. Morshead was 51 years old, a schoolteacher before the First World War, who had learned to fight in the trenches at Gallipoli. He had watched thousands of men die in that earlier war because generals ordered them to sit in holes and wait for Turkish bullets. He had survived by learning a different way. At Gallipoli, the Australians who lived longest were the ones who went out at night, who hunted the enemy instead of waiting to be hunted. Morshead had spent 20 years thinking about those lessons. British High Command expected him to follow their defensive playbook. They expected him to keep his men safe in their trenches and bunkers to preserve his forces for the relief that would surely come. Morshead took one look at the siege lines and made a decision that shocked his fellow commanders. He gathered his officers in a sandbagged bunker on his second day in Tobruk. The air inside was thick and hot, smelling of sweat and cigarette smoke. Maps covered a makeshift table made from ammunition crates. Morshead pointed at the German positions marked in red pencil, some less than 1,000 yards from the Allied trenches. His voice was calm, but his words were not. "We are not going to sit here and die slowly," he told them. "We are not going to wait for the Germans to pick us apart, piece by piece. From now on, we fight differently. Starting tonight, small teams would go out into no man's land. They would hunt German patrols. They would capture prisoners. They would make the enemy afraid to sleep." The British commanders thought he was insane. Night patrols were for gathering information, not for fighting. Sending men out into the darkness where German machine guns waited was wasteful and reckless. "You will lose your best soldiers for nothing," they warned. Morshead listened to their objections politely. Then he gave the orders anyway. The 9th Australian Division would not fight like the British. They would not fight like anyone the Germans had faced before. They would turn the siege inside out, making the hunters into the hunted. In the oppressive heat of that North African summer, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 2-1, the Australians prepared to teach the Wehrmacht a lesson about fear that would haunt German nightmares for the rest of the war. The plan Morshead created was simple, but required iron discipline, and nerves most men did not have. Teams of 6 to 12 soldiers would leave the trenches 2 hours after sunset. They would move silently across no man's land, staying low to the ground, using every shell crater and rock for cover. The distance to German lines varied, but most raids targeted positions between 50 and 200 meters from the Australian trenches. That meant crawling through sand and rocks for 30 to 40 minutes just to reach the enemy. The teams carried no rifles because rifles were too long and made noise when they scraped against rocks. Instead, each man carried a knife, a bayonet, and maybe a pistol wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. Some brought improvised clubs made from pick handles wrapped in barbed wire. These were weapons for killing up close, in the dark, where you could smell the other man's breath. The Australians removed their helmets before these raids because helmets caught the moonlight and made a distinctive silhouette that German sentries recognized. They blackened their faces and hands with burnt cork or oil so their skin would not reflect light. Many took off their boots and went forward in just socks because boots crunched on gravel and gave away positions. The goal was to become invisible and silent, to get right up to a German position before anyone knew they were there. Once there, they would strike fast. Kill the sentries, grab any prisoners they could, destroy whatever equipment looked valuable, then vanish back into the darkness before the Germans could organize a response. The entire operation, from leaving the trenches to returning, had to take no more than 4 hours. Any longer, and they risked being caught in the open when the sun came up. The first raids went out in early August 1941, just days after Morshead gave his orders. The targets were German observation posts on the high ground overlooking the Australian sector. These posts directed artillery fire during the day and watched for any Allied movement at night. Taking them out would blind the Germans and save Australian lives. The first team that went forward consisted of 9 men led by a lieutenant who had hunted rabbits on his family farm before the war. They left their trench at 10 at night. The temperature had dropped from the brutal daytime heat to something almost cold, maybe 50 degrees, and the men shivered as they crawled. They could hear German voices ahead, relaxed and careless, men who thought they were safe behind their wire and machine guns. It took the Australians 45 minutes to cross 200 meters of open ground. They cut through the German wire with clippers that had been wrapped in cloth tape to prevent any metallic sound. Then they were inside the position. The whole fight lasted maybe 90 seconds. By 10 past midnight, they were back in their own trenches with 3 German prisoners and a map case full of documents. Not one Australian had been scratched. British High Command heard about the raid and immediately sent angry messages to Morshead. This kind of aggressive patrolling was wasteful and reckless, they said. He was risking his best men for a handful of prisoners and some papers. The siege required patience, not cowboy tactics. Sooner or later, one of these raids would go wrong, and he would lose an entire team to German machine guns. Then what would he have? Accomplished? Morshead read the complaints and filed them away. He sent his men out again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Within 2 weeks, the 9th Australian Division was running raids almost every night, sometimes 2 or 3 different teams going to different parts of the line. The man who saved Morshead from being ordered to stop was General Claude Auchinleck, the overall commander of British forces in North Africa. Auchinleck had watched other generals fail because they were too rigid, too stuck in the old ways of fighting. When he read the intelligence reports coming from the prisoners the Australians captured, he saw something valuable. The Germans were starting to crack. Their confidence was shaking. One prisoner, a corporal who had fought in France and Greece, told his interrogators that he would rather face a British regiment than spend another week opposite the Australians. The night raids were destroying German morale faster than any artillery barrage could. Auchinleck sent a message to Morshead in late August. "Keep doing what you are doing," it said. "You have my full support." The breakthrough came in early September. The Australians had learned that a German headquarters unit was operating from a fortified position about 300 meters beyond the front line. This was a bigger target than the observation posts, with more guards and better defenses. Morshead put together a larger raiding party, 24 men split into 3 teams. They spent 2 nights just watching the German position, learning the guard routines, counting how many men were there. On the 3rd night, September 7th, they went in. The lead team cut the wire at exactly midnight. The second team went left to block any reinforcements. The third team, the assault group, went straight into the German bunker. The fight was brutal and close. Men grappled in the darkness, stabbing and clubbing. Someone fired a pistol, and the muzzle flash lit up faces twisted with fear and rage. But the Australians had surprise, and they had trained for this kind of chaos. In less than 5 minutes, the German position was theirs. They grabbed 32 prisoners, killed or wounded at least a dozen more, and seized maps, radios, and code books. Then they pulled back before German artillery could plaster the area. Every single Australian made it home. Not one was even wounded. The intelligence haul from that raid was extraordinary. The code books helped British signals officers break German communications for weeks. The maps showed defensive positions the Allies had not known existed. But the most valuable thing the Australians brought back could not be measured in documents or prisoners. It was fear. German radio traffic, intercepted and decoded, started using new words to describe the Australians. They were devils, demons, ghosts. They did not fight like proper soldiers. They came in the night like criminals and murderers. Some German units started requesting transfers to other sectors, anywhere that was not facing the 9th Australian Division. The Australians were doing all this with almost no special equipment, no extra supplies, just knives and courage and tactics learned in another war a quarter century earlier. They were turning the Siege of Tobruk upside down, and the Germans were starting to realize they had seriously underestimated these colonial amateurs from the other side of the world. The numbers told a story that even the most skeptical British commanders could not ignore. In the 6 weeks before the Australians started their night raids, German probing attacks hit the Tobruk perimeter an average of 8 times per week. Each attack cost Allied lives and gave the Germans better intelligence about defensive positions. In the 6 weeks after the raids began, German attacks dropped to fewer than 3 per week. That was a 60% reduction in enemy aggression. The reason was obvious to anyone paying attention. The Germans were no longer confident about what waited for them in the darkness. They had gone from being the hunters to being the hunted, and it paralyzed their ability to gather information and plan attacks. Even more dramatic were the casualty figures. During night operations, the Australians were inflicting losses at a 3-to-1 ratio. For every Australian killed or wounded on a raid, 3 Germans fell. This was the exact opposite of what conventional military wisdom said should happen when attackers moved against prepared defensive positions. By October 1941, the 9th Australian Division had conducted over 150 separate night raids. Some were small reconnaissance patrols of just 4 or 5 men. Others were large assault operations with 30 or 40 raiders hitting multiple targets at once. The Australians kept detailed records of every mission. They mapped every German position they found. They interrogated every prisoner they captured. The intelligence they gathered became the foundation for Allied planning across the entire North African theatre. British commanders, who had initially dismissed Morshead's tactics as reckless gambling, now competed to get Australian units attached to their sectors. The raiders themselves became legends within Tobruk. Men who had been teachers, farmers, shop clerks, and factory workers 6 months earlier were now specialists in a brutal new kind of warfare that the modern military had forgotten. The Germans were not stupid, and they did not take this punishment without trying to fight back. Starting in late September, they implemented a series of countermeasures designed to stop the Australian raids. They tripled the number of flares fired every night, turning the darkness into day at random intervals to catch raiders in the open. They positioned machine gun nests in overlapping fields of fire so that any approach to their lines would be covered from multiple angles. They strung more barbed wire, sometimes 3 or 4 rows deep, and hung tin cans on the wire that would rattle if anyone tried to cut through. They even brought in patrol dogs, German shepherds trained to smell intruders and bark an alarm. Some German units started sending out their own patrols, trying to catch the Australians before they reached German lines. For a few weeks, these measures made the raids more dangerous and costly, but the Australians adapted faster than the Germans could build new defences. When the Germans started using more flares, the raiders learned to freeze absolutely still the moment a flare went up, becoming just another shadow among the rocks and craters. When the machine guns created killing zones, the Australians found the gaps between them and marked those routes for future raids. When the wire got thicker, they brought bigger cutters and more patience. The patrol dogs were a problem until one raid team captured a German dog handler and learned that the dogs were only released on certain schedules. After that, the Australians planned their movements around those schedules. The German countermeasures were based on the assumption that the Australians would eventually get discouraged and stop. That assumption was fatally wrong. A comparison with other units on the Tobruk perimeter showed exactly how effective the Australian tactics were. The British brigade, holding the sector immediately west of the Australians, used traditional defensive methods. They stayed in their trenches. They fired artillery at suspected German positions during the day. They sent out small patrols only when ordered to do so. Over the same 3-month period, from August through October, that British brigade lost 420 men killed or wounded. The Australian units, despite running aggressive raids almost every night, lost 290 men. They were attacking constantly, putting themselves in danger over and over, and still suffering fewer casualties than units that sat still and waited. The reason was simple. The Germans could not effectively target an enemy they rarely saw and never understood. The passive defenders were easy targets for German artillery and snipers. The Australians were ghosts. German war diaries captured later in the campaign revealed just how deeply the night raids had affected enemy morale. One entry from a German battalion commander, dated October 15th, read, "The nightly activity of the enemy has become unbearable. Men cannot sleep. Sentries fire at shadows. Morale is very low. Request permission to withdraw to secondary positions." Another diary from a sergeant in a reconnaissance unit described the Australians as not fighting like soldiers, but like assassins who have no honour or mercy. A third entry, this one from an Italian officer attached to a German unit, stated plainly, "My men refuse to patrol after dark. They say the Australians are devils who cannot be killed." I have had 2 men shoot themselves in the foot to avoid night duty. These were not the words of a confident, aggressive army. These were the words of men who had been broken psychologically. The scene of a typical raid from this period shows why the Germans felt such terror. Picture a moonless night in October, the air finally cooling after another scorching day. The temperature has dropped to maybe 60 degrees, but the rocks still hold the day's heat. An Australian patrol of 10 men moves through no man's land, crawling on their bellies through sand that gets into everything: their eyes, their mouths, their weapons. They have been moving for over an hour, covering less than 200 meters, slow as death itself. Ahead, they can hear German voices, nervous chatter in a language they do not understand. A cigarette glows red in the darkness, marking a sentry who has broken the rules about smoking on duty. The Australians inch closer. At 50 meters, they can smell the Germans, the scent of different tobacco, different food, different soap. At 20 meters, they can hear individual words: a soldier complaining about the cold, another laughing at a joke. The lead Australian raises his hand and the patrol freezes. They wait. 5 minutes. 10. A German sentry walks past, so close they could reach out and touch his boot. He sees nothing, hears nothing. He walks on. Then the Australians move again. The attack, when it comes, is sudden and savage. A hand over a mouth, a blade between ribs, a muffled cry cut short. In 90 seconds, 3 Germans are dead, 2 are prisoners being dragged back toward Australian lines, and the raiders are already gone, melting into the darkness like they were never there at all. The psychological warfare was just as important as the physical casualties. The Germans never knew when the Australians would come. They never knew where. They never knew if tonight would be quiet or if tonight would be the night when shadows turned into knives and their friends died screaming. This constant uncertainty destroyed sleep, destroyed focus, destroyed the confidence that soldiers need to function. Some German units began to crack under the pressure, reporting higher rates of sickness, more accidents, more cases of what we would now call combat stress. The Australians, meanwhile, grew more confident with each successful raid. They had discovered something powerful. Aggression, intelligence, and unpredictability could defeat superior numbers and superior equipment. By November 1941, other Allied units were beginning to adopt Australian methods. British commando trainers came to Tobruk to study the raiders. Plans were being made to spread these tactics throughout the entire Allied army. The 9th Australian Division had not just defended a port. They had revolutionized how modern soldiers thought about night combat. The Siege of Tobruk finally lifted in December 1941 after 241 days of continuous combat. The 9th Australian Division had held against everything Rommel could throw at them, and they had done it by refusing to fight the way everyone expected. But the night raids did not end when the siege ended. Instead, they evolved and spread like wildfire through the Allied armies in North Africa. What had started as one general's desperate gamble in a surrounded port became the foundation for how modern armies think about special operations and unconventional warfare. The lessons learned in the darkness outside Tobruk would shape military tactics for the next 80 years and counting. The real test of whether the Australian methods worked came at El Alamein in October 1942. This was the battle that would decide North Africa, perhaps the entire war in that theatre. The 9th Australian Division was given a crucial role in the initial assault. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 8th Army, had studied what Morshead's men accomplished at Tobruk. He ordered the Australians to lead the breakthrough on the northern section of the line, the area where German and Italian defences were strongest. The night before the main attack, Australian raiding parties went forward just like they had at Tobruk. They cut wire. They killed sentries. They created confusion and fear. When the main assault began on October 23rd, the 9th Division smashed through positions that other units could not crack. They used the same aggressive, relentless tactics they had perfected during the siege. Attack at night, move fast, hit hard, disappear before the enemy can react, then do it again. The breakthrough at El Alamein led directly to Rommel's defeat and the eventual Allied victory in North Africa. The Australians had proven their methods worked not just in defence, but in major offensive operations too. By early 1943, the night raiding tactics had become standard practice across multiple Allied armies. British commando units adopted Australian methods wholesale, sending trainers to learn from veterans of the Tobruk raids. The newly formed Special Air Service, the SAS, built their entire operational doctrine around principles the Australians had demonstrated. Small teams, aggressive action, operations under cover of darkness hit the enemy where he feels safe. The Americans, preparing for their own campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, sent observers to study how the Australians trained their raiders. Training camps across the Allied world began teaching soldiers how to move silently, how to kill quietly, how to turn darkness from an obstacle into a weapon. Tens of thousands of men learned skills that a few hundred Australians had invented out of necessity in the desert. What had been a desperate improvisation by a surrounded garrison became a central pillar of modern military training. The scale of this transformation was remarkable. Before Tobruk, night operations were considered risky and of limited value. Armies used darkness to move troops or supplies, not to attack. After Tobruk, every major Allied operation included plans for night raids and infiltration. By 1944, the British Army alone had trained over 40,000 men in advanced night combat techniques derived directly from Australian methods. The US Army Rangers, the British Commandos, the Canadian Special Service Battalions, all of them owed a debt to what Morshead and his division had proven was possible. The casualty statistics validated the approach. Units trained in Australian-style night operations consistently suffered lower losses while inflicting higher enemy casualties than units using conventional tactics. The numbers were undeniable. Aggression saved lives. Unpredictability saved lives. Refusing to fight by the enemy's rules saved lives. Major General Leslie Morshead received recognition for his leadership at Tobruk, though perhaps not as much as he deserved. The British government awarded him a knighthood, making him Sir Leslie Morshead. Australia promoted him and gave him command of larger formations. But Morshead was never the type of man who sought glory or publicity. He had been a schoolteacher before the First World War, and in many ways he remained a teacher throughout his military career. His greatest satisfaction came from seeing his ideas validated, from knowing that the methods he championed had saved lives and changed how armies fought. After the war, he returned to civilian life and rarely spoke publicly about his military service. He died in 1959 at the age of 69, remembered by those who served under him as a commander who valued soldiers' lives more than his own reputation. The 9th Australian Division's record spoke for itself. During the Tobruk siege, they suffered approximately 3,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. That was serious, but it was far lower than what conventional defensive tactics would have cost. More importantly, they inflicted over 10,000 casualties on German and Italian forces, while capturing more than 1,500 prisoners. The intelligence they gathered helped the Allies understand German tactics and equipment throughout the North African campaign. Several German units that fought at Tobruk specifically requested not to face Australian forces again in later battles. That kind of psychological dominance was unprecedented, and it came from tactics that experts had called wasteful and reckless. The broader lesson from Tobruk reaches beyond military history into fundamental truths about human nature and innovation. When conventional wisdom fails, when the accepted way of doing things leads only to defeat, Survival demands creative thinking. Morshead and his Australians succeeded because they refused to be bound by what was supposed to work. They looked at their situation with fresh eyes and asked a simple question. What if we do the opposite of what everyone expects? What if instead of waiting to be attacked, we attack first? What if instead of treating darkness as an obstacle, we use it as our greatest advantage? These questions led to methods that seemed crazy until they proved brilliantly effective. The innovation came not from superior technology or resources. The Australians had less of both than the Germans, but from adaptability and willingness to challenge assumptions. This lesson remains relevant today in ways that go far beyond military operations. Modern special forces around the world, from the US Navy SEALs to the British SAS to Australian commandos, still use tactics descended directly from what the 9th Division pioneered at Tobruk. Night vision technology has changed how darkness operations work, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Small teams, aggressive action, psychological warfare, hitting the enemy where and when he least expects it. The Tobruk raiders would recognize the operational methods of today's special operators, even if the equipment looks like science fiction. But the deeper lesson applies to any field where innovation matters. Sometimes the people with the most experience and the most impressive credentials are exactly the wrong people to solve a new problem. They are too invested in the old ways, too certain that what worked before will work again. The German commanders at Tobruk had conquered most of Europe. They had defeated armies far larger and better equipped than the Australians. Their confidence was understandable, but it blinded them. They could not imagine that colonial troops from a backwater country could teach them anything about warfare. That blindness cost them dearly. Meanwhile, Morshead, a former school teacher who had learned to fight in the trenches of Gallipoli, saw the situation clearly precisely because he was not bound by recent success. He remembered what worked when everything else failed. The final truth that emerges from the story of the 9th Australian Division at Tobruk is both simple and profound. The Germans called the Australians devils because they did not fight like men, by which the Germans meant they did not follow the accepted rules of civilized warfare. They came in darkness like criminals. They used knives instead of rifles. They refused to stand and fight in the open like proper soldiers. But that was exactly the point. The Australians won because they understood that following your enemy's rules is the fastest path to defeat. The Germans had written the rules for modern mechanized warfare, and those rules had given them victory after victory. The Australians wrote new rules, older rules actually, rules about fear and darkness, and the primal human terror of threats you cannot see coming. In doing so, they proved that sometimes refusing to fight like men, refusing to meet expectations, refusing to do what you are supposed to do, is exactly what it takes to win. That lesson echoes through history and remains as true today as it was in the desert darkness outside Tobruk in 1941.